Perfect. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second industry discussion in March. OFNC had our first discussion this month talking with the head of Xero on how accounting is going to be innovated through open finance. And we felt passionate about bringing this discussion in March as well, from an industry discussion talking about the importance of a consumer data right with an Australian expert. So in today's session, we're really excited to welcome everyone from our network, from our membership, from our board, and from the industry as we gather insights on what's happening on the Australian market, how fast they're moving, and what they're facilitating with their infrastructure. Can I ask everybody to put themselves on mute? Carrie, maybe.
Yeah, he's in a zone.
I don't know, Rachel, if you can help with mute across. Oh, there you go. Thanks, Carrie. So first, I'd love to start off with just some introductions. I think the first thing, considering everyone probably saw the news that Barrowell in a Logic article was sharing that the budget in Canada, unfortunately in 2023, does not have any budget for open banking. So we'll definitely jump into that discussion as well, but just thought I would address that to the room. So I'm your host, Michelle Beyo, CEO and founder of Finavator, as well as the interim president for the Open Finance Network of Canada. I'm excited to have one of our incredible board members, Roy Ko, to join us today and be our moderator for today's session. So I will pass the mic over to Roy to share a little bit about himself and his work at OFNC.
Hey everyone, I'm sure you don't want to hear from me, you just want to hear from Jamie and Michelle, so I'll be very, very brief. Thrilled to be here to be helping out our standing in for our usual moderator, Cindy Zhang, who I'm not sure where Cindy is this week. I was asked to stand in. So I've been a board member at Open Finance Network, formerly OBIC, for 3 years now. And we're thrilled to continue to be able to bring this series to you, thanks to Tyler's work of Michelle Beyo and her team, Rachel at Finavator, of constantly securing speakers, fantastic speakers, and the subject. And so without further ado, why don't we get on with the program?
Thank you, Roy. Well, Jamie, it's just such an honor. I was saying a mutual friend connected us as I was asking her who could be an expert speaker on consumer data rights, as I'm just so intrigued by what it enables and all of the work that you've done within your career. Jamie, can you maybe, because I don't think I could do your background justice, can you share a little bit about yourself, your role, and your passion for open banking, open finance?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Michelle. And it's a pleasure to be here today. Nobody likes to read out their bio. It always feels that little bit self-promoting. But in essence, I am a self-confessed fintech fanatic. I'm a data nerd. I have had a very, very, a wonderful, broad, diverse career, quite a lot in financial services. I've spent time in defense, telecommunications, and I've ran tech startups and scale-ups. And the one thing that they've all had in common is data. Data is evidence, data is information, and with context, data becoming knowledge. So when I left running tech companies, I got involved in open data. And I was the CEO of the Open Data Institute in Australia before standing up Open Data Australia. And I had the privilege of working between industry and government. And it's an interesting thing because both sides see the world very, very, very differently, which sort of it's a bit of a lead on to today's topic. But what became evident is if you can get the right data in the right hands at the right time, you can really change the world. So when the opportunity to become the regional director for the Australia-New Zealand APAC region of FDATA, the Global Trade Association, I jumped at it because I saw an opportunity to help form the basis of consumer data right in Australia. And since then, I've had the opportunity to go on to leading a wonderful product team in the development of products and solutions specifically for this, this topic. So I had the privilege of meeting Michelle, as she said, through a mutual friend at an international conference, and honoured to join you today to tell you a little bit about Australia's crazy journey into what we hope will become an open data economy.
Thank you so much, Jamie. So inspiring, and to see the journey, especially because Australia has been one of the fastest paced open banking, open finance kind of enablements, and hearing that New Zealand has followed suit with many of your infrastructure aspects is exciting as well. So I'm going to go back and forth between me and Roy, but I'm going to take the first question, Roy. What is a consumer data right, and why is it so important?
That's a great one. I think when we look at open data, when we look at open banking, there's many different versions and forms that it can take, all of them hopefully leading to the same outcome of, once again, putting the right data in the right hands. Now, why are consumer data right in Australia as opposed to just calling it open banking? Pretty much comes from some of our legislative constraints. A right being a legal obligation, if you like. And when Australia went down the path of moving consumer data or enabling that data to flow with consent from a consumer as a direction, they chose to amend our Competition Act. And in doing so, basically saying if industry is going to be required to perform these acts in a certain manner with certain details, timing, for instance, it was worth making it through the legislation. They then said through that legislation that will give the broad outline of what is required. And if you fail to comply, it is actually against a piece of, legal legislation, if you like. But they said that should not be so prescriptive that becomes the rules of engagement. So the intention was always change the legislation so that whatever was designed, designated as industries or sectors, designated as data sets, different things, the common points, the definition of data, for instance, that was outlined in legislation. They then said, let the regulators and the government then design and launch the rules, if you like, of engagement for each sector at the time that it's going to come online, because they recognise that there would be subtle nuances. There is a big difference between energy data, for instance, and banking data. There was no opportunity to make a one-size-fits-all. The other thing was, if you remember, there's 4 reasons for open banking or open data existing. And these reasons were very specific and personal to each country that has gone down this journey. There was an opportunity to eradicate financial crime and fraud by meaning that transactions had to become digital as opposed to cash-based. There's an opportunity to eradicate poverty, if you like, meaning that the unbanked could be banked. There's the opportunity to force competition, if you like, into some of those jurisdictions that are seen to have very upper level banks that make it really difficult for new players to come on the scene. And there's an opportunity to enhance innovation in an area that will, in the end, benefit consumers particularly. And that's the path that Australia took. In part, consumer to build trust and transparency, data because that's what it's about, right because it was actually legally enforced.
That's great. Thank you, Jamie. So in reading the second question, what role does consumer data right play in ensuring good privacy and data protection outcomes for consumer? I'm gonna go with the script and ask you that question, and then I actually gonna have my own follow-up after that, if I may be permitted to do so.
Oh, absolutely. There's nothing I like better than going off script. So another big element of the Australian version or our consumer data right is we chose not to introduce a separate, I guess, iteration of a privacy law or a privacy act. Now, that being said, we are in the middle or almost to the end of a 5-year review into our privacy act to see if it is still fit for purpose with the amount of digital traffic and the changes in the way that privacy is being viewed and data protection especially. But the Consumer Data Right had to take all of these things into consideration. So written into the Consumer Data Right are safeguards, if you like, which literally becomes almost the morals and the ethics of the way that this industry has to comply with it. There are privacy guards, there are 12, and literally it is saying privacy must be maintained. No data can move until a legitimate consent is received. That consent needs to outline the purpose, the length of time that the consent exists, and that's up to a maximum of 12 months with an enduring consent. And there are all sorts of outlines. Who can send the data? How can it be received? What's the format? The biggest thing in data protection, though, is the use of closed APIs. So the Consumer Data Right goes as far as some would say in being particularly onerous in the technical capacity. But if you think about it, it is all in an aim to create consistency, to build trust and transparency in the way that this data is moving, and to try to reduce this perception of, well, what if my data gets into the wrong hands? Or what if somebody asks for my data without me knowing? So it was really important for this technology to be almost a closed loop. And in part, that is to protect privacy, that is to enhance data protection, as much as to give confidence to the industry that they know exactly what is required at any point in time, and they know how to comply with both the regulation and the legislation.
That's great. So I want to follow up on my going off the script questions, if I may. Given that you have some unique views of having seen it from the public sector and now the private sectors, I'm not sure how much you know about the Canadian open banking journey, but there's our journey so far is fraught with a little hand-wringing about the hybrid model with between the government and the private the private enterprise and the roles and responsibilities they play. So from a consumer data right perspective, I would love given that you've seen it from multiple angles, what roles and responsibility do you think in ensuring consumer data right and it's now that it's enshrined in law, what roles and responsibilities should the government play? What roles and responsibilities should private parties, i.e. banks and other ecosystem participants play? And equally important, what role should consumers play in ensuring that this lives up to its promise?
Absolutely, that's a fantastic question, Roy. I'm trying to be tactful when I answer this. Look, there's been a lot of discussion on who's overreaching, who's underreaching, who's not taking up, their end of the task or the responsibility. In my humble opinion, there is a role to play for all three parties in a successful consumer data right. There does have to be somebody that acts as an overarching authority that kicks this off. Now, it would generally in a democratic nation, and I'll explain that statement in a minute, it would generally be somebody of a government status. Now, whether it's a regulator or a department, I don't think that matters. What does matter, though, is somebody needs to articulate what the rules of engagement are. So I often liken it to a game of sport. So there's a sporting arbitrary body that would normally say this is a sport, this is how it's meant to be played. Then you would normally have industry that would say, okay, now we're clear on what we can and can't do. We want to solve for that in the most imaginative, innovative, competitive way in the spirit of the game. So there are certain jurisdictions that said these are the boundaries, if you like, of the oval or the sporting pitch. Now industry, as long as you're playing within them, be as imaginative as you want. And we certainly saw that through the UK with Europe. We saw new payment rails springing up. We saw cool, innovative ways that people were building to the technical standards. if you like. But then what part does the consumer play? Well, it almost feels like they're an afterthought in a lot of cases. Here, we've built this amazing thing for you. Now, why aren't you using it? And that's an interesting piece as well, because in some jurisdictions, not necessarily saying Australia, but I think Australia's in this camp as well, it's been built to great expense and in some cases inconvenience by industry. But there has been zero public education and awareness actually put out by any party. So largely the consumers, let's be honest, don't know a lot about it yet, which is part of the reason that you start to see slow take-ups. It's part of the reason that then people go, oh, have we spent all of this time and effort? But what we've seen in other jurisdictions is as industry starts to talk about their wonderful reduced time frame, time to yes for lending, for instance, or start to encourage consumers, you don't need to bring me all of those documents anymore. Why don't you just consent to me accessing your data digitally? This is where we start to see the consumer come into play. But because of the length of time it's been in Australia, we haven't had a lot of challenges by consumers saying that this did not work or did not meet their expectations. So if we look at it, I think government has a role of setting this up in the start. I think industry should have a part to play in being as innovative and competitive as they can, because at the end of the day, these are going concerns. These are businesses that are participating. They need to have a balance sheet. They need to bring in revenue. And then consumers' part to play, number one is to use it, but number two is to educate themselves about what this is and how to use it safely and what to look out for. In Australia, for instance, we have quite a visible trademark, and any entity that is accredited to participate in this ecosystem must display the exact trademark at an exact location on their consent page for whatever solution they've got. This is where the consumer has a responsibility, I guess, to look for that trademark. In Australia, we've got a Made in Australia logo. It used to be a little yellow triangle with a kangaroo in the middle. I'm not sure if Canada has something equivalent, but that starts to build the trust and transparency of it. The last part, so you've got accreditation. Sorry, there's two other elements, Roy. I'm rambling now, so I apologize.
No, this is perfect. You're actually touching all the important elements on our challenge in open banking.
Oh, thanks, Roy. So the two other elements I haven't spoken about is the accreditation entity. And then I think there is the, there's almost like the umpire or the entity that enables this ecosystem to thrive and to flourish. So in my mind, accreditation is incredibly important. There needs to be somebody that checks, have these apps, are the banks, for instance, that are going to connect via these APIs, have they got their data standards at an acceptable level? Is everything locked tight from a cyber perspective? What if it's a different sector? I mean, energy's data is very different to banks. They can't pick up the same APIs that banks produce. They need to produce their own. So accreditation, not so much from the data holders, because generally they're large companies. We have a certain amount of faith that they're going to meet minimum cyber standards, they've got the insurances, they've passed the fit and proper person test, but it's more from the smaller end. These are the really innovative little companies that are going to drive adoption by consumers. It's that app that helps you round up for your chosen charity. It's that financial management tool that's going to help you retire 5 years earlier. They need to have that accreditation entity to help them meet the minimum standards. I think this is critical in any ecosystem where open data is going to be mandated. But the last entity that is often forgotten, is that middle enabling entity. Now, I don't think this necessarily needs to be government. I think it has to be an authority of some sort that people recognise their integrity and their power. This is where you start to see test harnesses. So if you're that company that wants to get accredited, as we saw in the UK, there was a central testing facility. You want to know if your APIs meet the minimum standards. You want to make sure they're working properly. work with this authority. You want to have the directory held central and independently. This is the authority that should do it. This is actually the authority that does the heavy lifting once the initial rules have been drawn up. And I think this should also be the authority that when somebody isn't acting in the interest of the, of the whole charter, this should be the authority almost based on peer review that really wraps that entity over the knuckles with good nature, assuming that they have made a mistake and they're not deliberately trying to avert the system. This central entity, I think, is critical in enabling that health of the ecosystem.
What an amazing set of answers. You really did touch upon, whether you realize it or not, some of the key challenges in our government's journey in open banking, and accreditation is a word that is brought up very, very often. I'm sure I have other questions, but I loved your metaphor for the sporting body. I'm a big Formula One fan. Of course, Formula One is in Melbourne this weekend, and,
yes, it is.
So
yes.
The constant struggle between FIA and the teams and the drivers as the three parties with this sometimes shared, sometimes conflicting interests is a metaphor that came immediately to mind. So thank you for that, Michelle.
Yeah, I like the F1 analogy because I could totally see the three bodies, but you need different players to kind of see the system and coach it through, because it's not like you create a consumer data right and it's over. There's definitely different pieces to facilitating this ecosystem.
Absolutely. And even on that part, it would be so unrealistic to think one party, whether it's government or industry or a consumer advocacy, a group, for instance, would have sufficient 360 view to truly do it justice. There's a reason why I think these three parties are so critical, because they each bring something unique to the table, and that's how you build out the robust, system with longevity. I think it's the only way that truly makes sense, if I can say it so flippantly.
No, I really appreciate that. And to glean some light into us all holding our breath over here, as I said, our budget just came out this week with no actual dollars to open banking. So I think that's kind of deflated the hope of a lot of people within the industry. We don't currently yet know what the accreditation process or body is or will look like, and we don't have an API standard chosen just yet. So we have some pieces of the puzzle that you described that we're still waiting with bated breath to find out about. But when I look at Australia, the things that excite me is how many TTPs and how much the ecosystem, though they were an oligopoly and very similar to Canada, came together, not just for open banking, open finance, open energy, open telco, like to the mission of open data. So maybe you could share a little bit about watching your country go through this process from 2017 to now, and what most excites you of what has been able to come out of this.
Oh, absolutely. Great questions. Sometimes when I think this all kicked off in 2017, it feels like it was a lifetime ago. But if you look at it in the grand scheme of things, this has moved along at such a lightning pace. And for some mandatory participants, especially some of the data holders, this would not have been on their radar in a million years, but they have had to comply because, as I said right at the start, it's a legislative requirement. I had a conversation with Scott Farrell way back in the beginning. And I said to Scott when this, it was first drawn up, oh my gosh, Scott, you've literally swung for the rafters. I'm going to keep going back to sports. Australia loves sports, as I know Canada does as well. I said, you've swung for the rafters. Was open banking not enough for you? And he looked at me and said, Jamie, you of all people should know, no, it's not enough. But I also knew that in the grand scheme of things, to get an amendment to a piece of legislation is difficult. You're not going to get two bites of the cherry in quick succession. So if you're going to change legislation, change it from the start to pave the way for what the end picture is to become, possible. So in Scott's mind, if this was really to supercharge a truly open data digital economy, which is what Australia was striving for from 2015. It was first spoke about. This would enable each designated sector to come online at a point that made sense, at a pace that the accreditors and the government and the regulators that were denoting the rules and the data standards body that could keep publishing and maintaining the compliance of the APIs, that it would be possible. So whilst open banking, very much first cab off the rank, primed to increase competition, desperately in need of innovation, was the start. Plus, let's be honest, we had a little bit of a playbook out of the UK and Europe that we could learn from, along with many other nations that were going through the journey at the same time. But we always knew that there would be value in sharing data, not just financial data, but there was going to be value in utilities data. Whether that's energy and telco, you could start to bring water or gas. If you think of the use cases where you can start to merge different data sets together for those end benefit of the consumer, whether that be an individual, a family, or a small to medium enterprise, they're all consumers. So this is not just about the mum or the dad, if you like, sitting at home. This is very much also about businesses being able to benefit from the right data in the right hands at the right time, in the right manner, if I want to expand that even more. So I've lost track of the question. Sorry, Michelle, I've gone off on a tangent.
No, you're quite allowed.
No, thank you. So it was really important to say, we're going to set up the parameters. We're going to do it in a way that we can expand and expand rapidly. And it was important to expand rapidly because we didn't want to lose momentum. And we also didn't want any one industry or sector to feel like they'd bear this burden in a disproportionate way. That being said, there's also been a lot of learnings with each subsequent sector. So you'll notice in Australia that there was no threshold set. When banks were forced to share data, it was everybody in. Any listed deposit, authorised deposit taking institution in Australia had to mandatorily share data by a certain date. And they did go first with the big four because it was felt that they, apart from having 80% of the accounts, would have the means behind them to go early. And then everybody else, that's the remaining 110 brands/entities, had to be live by a certain date. But when they came to energy and telecommunications as the next cabs off the rank, they sat down and they went, this is going to be very costly to some of the very small players. So they said, instead of the big four banks, we'll start with the big three energy companies and the big three telecommunications companies. And then we're going to say any energy company with 10,000 accounts or more, you must comply. Or any telecommunication retailer with 10,000 accounts or more, you must comply. But they started to see that some of the significant challenges that the really small players, some of the regional, the mutuals, the credit unions that didn't have anywhere near the balance sheets of the bigger banks, this was really onerous and quite costly, and in some ways still yet to have really seen the financial benefit of participation. So we're seeing an evolving system. We're seeing a system that is being tailored. We're seeing a system that is being applied logically and compassionately as it progresses. What we're going to see next, open finance is a massive, massive big collection of really designated sectors. Non-bank lending, superannuation, our retirement entity. I don't know if you have superannuation in Canada. It's like our 401k, if you like. We're going to have general insurance. Big reason they didn't touch life or health insurance, and happy to touch on that later if you like, but you talk about privacy implications. Nobody wants to share health data. You might look at wealth management. So imagine if you could start to share your investment account along with your bank records when you're applying for a certain facility or wanting to prove you've got capacity in a way. You might see crypto or digital currencies being able to be shared. Buy now, pay later. This open finance category is going to be broken down into almost individual sectors within a larger sector. So that's what's coming to life now in front of our eyes.
That's amazing. And please, don't apologize for going off on a tangent, because that's what we're here. We invited an out of town and out of jurisdiction guest to speak, purely because we, are desperately looking for potential solutions and insight from other jurisdictions. So this is perfect. And with that was my nice way of saying I'm going to go off script again. And
Please
so, so in my previous question, when I followed up, you touched upon, like I said, all the third rails, if you will, of some of these topics about accreditation, about consumer education, what I'm super passionate about, because one of the lessons learned from UK, for example, has been consumer education, and why when HM Treasury started being able to pay taxes is when open banking sort of took off, because now everybody's pay taxes. So with that in mind, one of the bugbears that the Canadian open banking and the Canadian open banking lead and all the participants are really trying to grapple with, and I know it's leading to some of the delays, is liability. So you mentioned in about 5 minutes ago, there are big entities and small entities, and that is but a large part, significant part of the crux of the problem is that between the large and the big banks, big six, versus the smallest of the entities. So how has, or maybe they haven't, has Australia solved for a liability issue, and what were some of the key pillars or considerations on the road to that? Because that is something that we're all trying to grapple with, whether in consulting or when you're inside the institutions.
Look, that is a wonderful question. It is a very, very long question that I'm not going to bore you with, liability from a civil penalty. But what I will say is liability is handled in two ways. And this has been, some people think that this has been a little bit of overkill in Australia. But the joke is, this is what happens when you get a lawyer to literally do the review into open banking. And bless Scott, he did an amazing job. If anybody has read the original Blue Report, the review into open banking, you get to the middle of it and there are literally pages and pages of scenarios played out as to who is liable for what at what time. You think about liability, it comes in many different ways. It could be the fact that somebody has accessed data without the correct consent. Who's liable? It could be that a consumer has consented for data, and I'm not saying this is technically possible, but the perception is, what if I consent to data from through app A to bank B, and they send the wrong data, or they send my data to a different app? The old remedy, what happens if my data is sent to the app and my bank account is cleaned out? Now, once again, I'm saying not that a number of these aren't even technically possible, but when you're dealing with reform at a government level, there are often fears raised, whether they're realistic or not, and sometimes it makes government a little bit nervous. It's that what if? What if I bring a right, an act, a policy, a piece of legislation to play, and one of my constituents are harmed by it? These are some of the considerations that I have seen around the world where governments become a little bit gun shy, if you like, of not wanting to introduce something that there is a perception that harm can come, and then who is liable to make good on that, whether it's financial. The other issue we've got is, I don't believe there's a jurisdiction in the world that has been able to satisfy on what is the actual cost of a data breach. And it is something that is acutely, it is feared globally. We look at the GDPR. Part of the reason the GDPR went so heavy on fines for non-conformance is they didn't know what a reasonable level would be. So if I am a big tech company and I just decide to access all of my consumers' data without consent, it's a data breach. And we've seen plenty of them getting fined throughout Europe and the UK. and it is either 20 million euros or 2% of your annual turnover, the greater of the two. We've seen huge fines being fielded, hundreds of millions of euros at a time. But if you sat there and you thought, in a data breach, whether it stays in that big entity that accessed the data without consent, or it is then shared on, there are an infinite number of ways that a consumer could be perceived to face harm. So liability, I think, is that natural central point that everybody defaults to out of concern. But if you look at some of the technical and the cyber standards that are baked into the Australian Consumer Data Right, it is to mitigate as much as possible to the potential for these things to be accessed by onerous actors, if you like. So nefarious actors, sorry. So let's have a closed API so it's not easily hacked. Let's make consent mandated, and that consent to be tokenized, and that consent to be maintained as an auditable record of the digital movement of data. Let's make sure that only entities that meet a certain threshold and are accredited can even participate in this framework. It is, in my humble opinion, a much safer way than any traditional method of sharing data. How many people scan their mortgage statements or scan their driver's license and they attach it to an email to their bank manager and they send it through an unencrypted method? Or back in my banking days, people would come in with their principal ID, their passport, their driver's license. You would take a photocopy, you would put it in a manila folder in a drawer in a client's file or a consumer's file, and that would outlive your tenure with that institution. And if you went back a number of years later, there would be archive boxes collecting dust in a storeroom with everybody's personal information. If you're lucky, it found its way to an incinerator. Who could have had access to that data that whole time, and not once did we think, is our bank going to be liable if that data gets out? And now we're deploying digital methods of sharing data in real time, which is more secure and safer than anything we've had before. And it's our natural default to say, well, who's liable if it goes wrong? I think the best thing that governments can do is think about this really carefully, make clear guidelines, publish clear areas or paths to remedy should somebody do the wrong thing, and make it known that there will be repercussions if somebody does not act pursuant to the requirements of the data sharing. Whether that's civil penalty, whether that's, I hate to say it, threats of imprisonment if somebody willfully, totally neglects the Privacy Act. We have, through the legislation, there's liability, there's penalties, there's all sorts of things. And then through the actual rules and regulations, there's, additional. We have a sponsorship affiliate, a CDR representative model in Australia. So if you are not big enough or have the means to become a fully unrestricted accredited participant, you can literally come up underneath the umbrella of somebody else. Now, if you are that larger app provider, for instance, there are significant penalties if you fail to maintain satisfactory controls. You almost become liable on behalf of the person that you're sponsoring. So there has been a lot of thought put into the ecosystem and the models and who should be responsible. But in New Zealand, for instance, I had a little bit to do with that system. Industry was trying to solve for it ahead of the government. So industry was saying, well, who's responsible if an API call is made from a bank and they send incorrect data? Maybe that consumer had moved 5 years earlier and hadn't updated their records. Those records were shared. A decision was made. An offer of some sort of service was made based on incorrect data. There was also this concept of once the bank shared the data, as it went downstream through the ecosystem, at what point their liability, they were let off the hook. So if you think about a representative model, there's three players in this. There's the tiny little, I'm using examples of size because it's easier to find, a little mum and dad app, that startup down the bottom. They don't have the money, they don't have the funds to take out full accreditation. So they approach a larger app player that might be, maybe they're complementary or they're already friends from a technical perspective, and say, look, you've already got accreditation. If I promise to be on my best behavior, will you sponsor me into this ecosystem? And that larger app says, sure, I trust you. I've done business with you for years, not a problem. So the consumer goes to the little app and says, I would like to share my data because you're going to help me retire early. That little app goes to the larger app and says, I need this data from this consumer's bank. Off goes the request via the API to the bank to share a certain data file. That data file trickles back down, and some cases will go through the bigger company before it gets to the little one. Now, the little company does something wrong. The little company has a data breach. The little company acts on incorrect data. Who's liable? The banks were saying, no, once we've sent the right data file, we're off the hook. Why should we be held liable if the consumer is harmed? And in a way, you can see that there is an argument from both sides. If you want to participate, you have to participate within certain rules set out at the time you decided to participate. Should the bank be held responsible because another part of the ecosystem did the wrong thing? If we think about schemes these days, if you get defrauded on your credit card, for instance, your credit card company will often refund you that amount. You can dispute it through your bank. So there is precedence here where we are so quick to look at the banks and say, well, irrespective of who stuffed up, you've got to give me my money back. You've got to make me whole again. So liability, I don't think there is ever going to be a simple way. I do not believe there is a way that every participant is going to be happy. I think there is a logical way given today's reliance on digital transmissions of data, but there is a divergence when you look at data and the movement of money. And money will be more sensitive to the average consumer than their data is, for obvious reasons. Liability is complex. I think if it's written into the legislation, it can't be argued, but it's got to be reasonable. I mean, we're still looking at, traditional data breach penalties or breaches of the Privacy Act, where, you might be a mandatory $1 million fine, for instance, of breaching the Privacy Act. You could be moving $20 million in a transaction, in a payment. Is 1 million sufficient? So in some ways, I think liability still needs a lot of work, and particularly as we start to quantify what the potential harm to a consumer could be if there is a data breach as opposed to a grievous breach of privacy.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point, because I remember when Marriott breached 7.6 million consumers, they had no fine. And the only repercussion was they gave 1 year free subscription to some type of data security website. And then
we've had some, sorry, Michelle, I was going to say, we've had some really high profile data breaches in Australia over the last year. And
did they have anything to do with open banking, or were they just data breaches like Marriott?
No, just data breaches. In one case, they were doing some work on APIs and they left the side door open literally, and they came in. In another case, they were absolutely hacked. In another recent case, it was a third-party vendor has now allowed themselves, I'm trying to be careful and not mentioning names, to get every one of the customers for the last 10 years of this organization to have all of their data breached. And it's interesting because you listen to the way that these breaches are being handled publicly. In some cases, you're getting messages saying, oh, your data's been breached. It's okay. They just got your name, your email, your mobile phone number, but we don't think you had your photo ID on file. There's others where they're saying, yeah, they probably got your photo ID, your passport, your driver's license, your address, your mobile number, your date of birth, your name, probably should go and change your driver's license. And then there's others where it's health data that's been impacted. They got all of that, and they're now releasing your health data on the black web, on the dark web.
And none of this has to touch open banking. This is just everyday data breach infrastructure.
None of this
to clarify, because a lot of people are very nervous on open banking.
Not one of these has had anything to do with open banking. Not one of these has had a direct result or anything to do with data shared via a mandated API.
Great
we
statement.
saw in the UK, if I remember the stats correctly, within the first 12 months of open banking going live in the UK, claims of fraud against bank data rose by 60%. But as the central convening body started to investigate, it turned out that nearly all of them were actually false understanding of what the actual system was meant to do. Not one of them was actual fraud, where somebody had been able to glean their details via an open banking API and then misrepresent them or do something without consent.
I love that, because I had looked into Australia, Brazil, and the UK and couldn't find any major data breach from open banking in any of the countries. Therefore, the liability having structure is good, but none of them have had to utilize the structure.
Exactly. And in Australia, we still have almost a voluntary notifiable privacy breach policy, much as you said with Marriott. So even if you do sustain a breach, if you tell our Office of the Australian Information Commissioner within a certain time frame and you explain how you're remedying it and everything else, of those 3 significant breaches we've seen in the last 6 months, I am unaware of any significant fines that have gone out yet. Now, that's not to say these things take time, but as you said before, not one of them are in any way related to the consumer data right.
Well, thank you for that answer, because I'm really glad we're recording this. I really think we need to go back and transcript your answer in order to catch it.
I'm trying to make sure I haven't mentioned any names. Because
we will redact
if this is being recorded, Roy, I don't need somebody saying you slandered my organization.
That will redact it, but it really was a lot of food for thought in your response about the liability. Thank you so much for that.
That's all right. Now, I know we've only got, I think, 10 minutes to go, and I see there's a few questions. Michelle, Roy, did you want me to keep going with the ones you'd listed, or do we want to answer some?
I think we
some
want to
random
answer
questions.
some questions from the audience with 10 minutes left.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Roy, I'll get the first one, and then if you want to jump in with the last couple. But Carrie Forbes, who runs League Data, which touches 40 different credit unions backend system, asked, would you have recommended for starting with smaller institutions based on this learning? And this was way back at the beginning of the discussion when you were talking about different parties coming into the system.
Absolutely. Look, one of the largest challenges we had in Australia, and I hope this answers your question, Carrie, was we went a very onerous path to accreditation. We also went a very onerous path to maintaining minimum compliance or mandated guidelines. So what that means is for the banks, you've got to think of, are they a digital bank or are they a traditional bank? Now, traditional banks have got quite often core banking systems, legacy banking systems that are quite complex, sometimes clunky, sometimes probably not where these organizations wish they were right now. Now, if you're going to mandate every type of financial services data set, that is a lot of work for them to get them into the format, into the, the governance of the data via the APIs that were mandated, via the mandatory consent framework, and push down that pipe in a certain way. It is a lot for the smaller end of town to justify when you've got to remember the data sharing has not yielded any financial benefit. It is an obligation that has been quite often forced upon these organisations. What we haven't seen yet is the widespread adoption by a number of these smaller players in the data recipient side, where they can start to compete, where they can start to create that greater internal efficiency. So the irony is they've been forced to comply. They've been forced to comply with some of their systems, which has needed a lot of work, a lot of massaging, a lot of finessing to get the data in the right format down these API rails. When they start to be able to bring in the data recipient, the use cases, they can start to enhance the customer experience. They can start to use analytics to personalize the way that they serve these customers, to differentiate themselves from the next small financial institution, to start to pre-approve products and create cradle to the grave type scenarios, where they can use these sorts of data to create greater internal efficiencies and start to reduce overheads. That's when this is all going to get flipped on its head, because this mandatory obligation that is cost is actually going to lead to them to start to potentially reduce overheads or create revenue streams. They needed to be bought into it. Is there a way they could have been bought in with less obligation, maybe less bandwidth of data sets initially? It's a tough one. I'm mindful that this has cost a lot of organizations a significant amount of money that they probably didn't even have in their budgets at that time frame. They've had to put off other technology adaptations or things to comply. In the end, I'd like to think it's all going to be for everyone's benefit. It's been tough in these first couple of years to justify for the really small end of town.
Thank you so much.
Carrie, please.
I was just going to I think you're bang on with where my headspace is right now in terms of what the conversations, and it mirrors, I think, the discussions we're having on that side. And I just very much appreciate the perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Carrie.
We may have lost Michelle Beyo. I'm not sure, but I'll take the next questions. Donna Galloway, a valuable member of our organization, has asked that you had mentioned previously about a UK playbook that you work from. Is there an actual playbook available for reference, or is it an understood discussions and relationship developed in the UK?
Yeah, look, thank you. We often talk about the playbook. No, there is no physical leather-bound playbook. I think if we had one, it would make life much simpler. Quite often when you go to different jurisdictions, for you to truly understand the nuances, you have to go to multiple different sources to get that information. So if you want to know what are the architectural requirements, you go to one authority. If you want to know the legislative side, well, sadly, you sit down with a whole massive lump of legislation. When you want to go to the rules and the regulations, they're actually published, but then they're quite often entered back into our Parliament as an amendment to the Act again, as each subsequent sector comes on board. If you want to know the way to get around your conformance testing, well, then you generally talk to industry. How to know what size font you need on the trademark, well, that's a different entity. And then you've got all of the anecdotal industry speak, if you like, on the quickest way to get from path A to path B without falling into every other pit hole that everyone else has. This is the playbook that I speak of that takes time and it takes connections. And, you know, I've worked with a number of organizations that just literally have struggled to work out what is their path to participation. It is really important to align yourself to organisations such as your own, Roy, that are going through this on the ground day to day. You would have heard, you know, the good stories, the bad stories, and you will start to put together what that looks like. And I really do believe it takes a community sometimes to enact this sort of change, and to go it alone in this day and age is foolish. You really need to work with your peers. And that could even be trying to influence common sense decisions. That could be trying to influence against regulators and governments to make logical, reasonable, and beneficial decisions as they go about this path. I do think that is the role of industry. And I do think the consumer's voice should be taken into consideration as you go through this, this creation path.
That's yes, consumer's voice. There it is again, right? It's something that we often talk about, but we don't action enough. And certainly, it's going to be an important ingredient for us. Michelle Windsor from board fellow member again from OFNC. I almost said OBIC. OFNC asked, and you had mentioned some metrics, I think, from the UK and in the early days of open banking. So Michelle wants to know, how has the fraud metrics been impacted since CDR has been put into a place in Australia, and how has there been any shifts, or are you starting to see some trends in terms of the fraud metrics since the days of CDR?
Oh, absolutely, and I'm so glad that Michelle asked about metrics. It is one of my pet subjects. Metrics are so important because metrics actually speak to truth. And there's two types of metrics that I think are critical in any ecosystem that goes through an open data evolution. There was one is performance. Performance metrics being visible and public and published is critical to establish that transparency and trust that everybody that participates, from consumers to business to government, needs to be held accountable. We need to see if you are a participant and you are mandated to have API calls work at a certain SLA within a certain time frame with a certain latency, you have to report with regularity whether you're meeting that minimum standard. This is the only way that we can truly say this system is efficiently operating and it's flourishing. But back to the metrics of interesting things such as fraud. We do not publish those metrics as a country yet, based purely on fraud. I can tell you that fraud rates in Australia, as the organisation I work for has an amazing financial crimes and fraud monitoring service, they are going through the roof, but not as a result of open banking. We are in a crisis in this country, as I'm sure everyone is, with the amount of credit card fraud, bank account fraud, and human fraud we're seeing with scams and phishing and everything else. It is at an epidemic level. Open banking has not contributed to that. In fact, I am unaware of a single case in Australia. Now, this is me personally. I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I am unaware of a single claim of fraud being enabled via open banking in an open banking call or a transaction to date.
We're going to quote you on that, Jamie.
Yeah, no, I said I am unaware. I didn't say it hasn't happened. Go for it.
I'll take it.
No, I think we need to be really careful in separating the transmission of open banking and what might happen if the entity that's received it, that is then acting on it, using it, leaves their back door wide open for somebody to walk right in. And this is the danger. If that happens, the first time the press say this data was taken or this person was defrauded because of open banking, it jeopardizes the entire ecosystem and it will be false. It doesn't matter if it's false. What we need to do is make sure that in line with this raises our overall bar on how we treat data, how we value it. How does this enable us to increase our cyber awareness? How does this enable us to increase our cyber protections in our systems? There are penalties for if you lose data, even after you've got it through open banking. So that is acting as a deterrent at the moment and making sure participants try that little bit harder than maybe they would have before open banking. And that's a really exciting piece.
Absolutely love that. Sorry, I lost connection for a minute, but this has been such a lovely, empowering, insightful discussion on CDR. I'm so excited that you were able to join us, that we're able to record this, and that Roy was able to help moderate, because I think he got some great questions embedded in there. So thank you so much both for your time, and for all OFNC members for joining, board members and invited members. It's been such a pleasure. I can't wait to share this with the industry. So thank you so much, Jamie and Roy.
Thank you
No,
so
thank
much
you.
for the opportunity. And Roy, it's been a pleasure being interrogated by both you and Michelle. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well, thank
will
you for
bring you back.
answering those questions. We're going to bring you back for sure.
Oh, no, look, and I'm happy to travel. I've always wanted to go to Canada. I am yet to do it. So it's at the top of my bucket list.
We
We'll
will
make
make
it
that
happen.
happen.
Wonderful. Have a nice day, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jamie. Have a lovely day.
Thank you.